Hello, IB History Year 1 students. We're continuing on with our unit on the First World War, and this is video lesson number 6. And number 6 and number 7 are part 1 and part 2 of the topic trench warfare and its impact on soldiers. So let's start out with the experience of living in the trenches. And for many of you, this will be partially a review of something that you learned in ninth grade, but I'm hoping that I can expand on that knowledge and introduce you to some new material as well. So, the experience of living in the trenches was bad enough even before you start talking about the fighting. The trenches were dug 5 to 6 feet into the ground, and in northern France, that meant that there was a reasonable chance that during large portions of the year, the bottom of the trench was going to be filled with water, either because you were close to a river and digging 5 to 6 feet, you might get close to the water table and water would actually begin to seep up from the bottom of the trench, or simply the trenches would fill as a result of the rains, which were common in northern France, anywhere from the end of winter right through the beginning of winter. And even winter didn't really give a lot of relief from the water because there were enough there were enough human there was enough presence of human beings with the warmth of our bodies in the trenches that oftentimes the water in the bottom of the trench did not freeze over during the winter time. It just became really, really cold and uncomfortable. And so it was not unreasonable, it was not uncommon for the bottom of the trench to have 4, 6, 8, 10 inches of water, sometimes more than that. And it was cold and stagnant, and this promoted the spread of disease. Leather boots didn't have they weren't treated with chemicals to make them waterproof, and so sometimes the leather effectively rotted right off of the feet and leaked, exposing men's feet to the cold. And trench foot was a condition that was experienced by virtually every soldier who fought in the First World War. It was a sort of an extreme, it was a combination of a sort of an extreme frostbite with a rot or fungus that caused the soft tissue of the feet to die. Remember that the farther a body part is away from the harder it is for that body part to stay warm. Um, the blood, when it circulates back to the heart, back to the core of the body, it gets warmed. And when the heart pumps it out to the body, it brings warmth, the warmth of the core out to the other parts of the body. Well, of course, by the time that the blood gets to the fingers, the feet, even the ears, it has given up a lot of its warmth. And so the feet, the ears, the fingers, the extremities, these are the parts of body which are most vulnerable to things like frostbite. And so trench foot was very common. Now, the case that you're seeing here in the photograph in the lower left-hand corner, which is a really, really awful thing to look at, that is a pretty extreme case of trench foot. Clearly, the what would be the soldier's left foot, we view it as the right, is in horrible shape. The other foot is probably closer to what a average case of trench foot looked like. You lived with trench foot. It was something that you didn't get admitted to the hospital for. They might clean you up, bandage you up, and send you back out to the trenches. Now, the case of the other foot would keep you in the hospital and perhaps might even send you home. But that looks like a pretty extreme case. Trench fever, on the other hand, was actually typhus, which is spread by lice. Um, Typhus is contracted usually when lice lay their eggs in the scalp, and of course that causes the scalp to become itchy, and soldiers want to scratch their scalp. And what would happen is they would simultaneously, if they scratched their scalp too much, they would create small breaks in the skin, which became entry points for typhus. because the lice, the adult lice that were carrying the typhus, were also still crawling around in the hair. And so when soldiers would reach up and scratch their scalp, they would do two things. Number one, after a while, they would create these little breaks in the skin, but they would also scratch the lice themselves, tearing their bodies open, and then the typhus would make its way from the whatever you want to call it, the residue of the scratched up louse into those little breaks in the skin. And so soldiers effectively infected themselves with typhus. And so delousing was a very common practice. Again, eventually a universal practice amongst the armies, an experience that virtually every soldier had to go through many times during the course of the war. And what you're seeing on the bottom here is soldiers who are having all of their hair cut off. All of their hair cut off. Their hair would be shaved, um, and they've been deprived of their clothing. And usually they were sprayed down. Usually they had a delousing powder that was sort of spread all over their bodies, and then they were sprayed down with hoses, and they were supposed to rub this delousing powder. It burned the eyes, it burned the skin, and then soldiers had to wait in a sort of a lodge that you see here for the delousing powder to take its effect. Then they would have their hair cut off so that it would make it harder for new lice to infect the scalp. And then they were given their fresh clothes back. So this was an uncomfortable, unpleasant, kind of humiliating procedure that most soldiers had to go through multiple times during the course of the war. The trenches tend to be infested with rats. You can imagine that it was sort of like rat heaven, because the soldiers didn't just sort of hunker down and fight in the trenches. They truly did live there, which meant that they ate there. And think about the residue of eating outdoors like that. Leftover apple cores or potato skins or chicken bones, things like that would inevitably either be left in the trench itself or in trash heaps right outside the trench. And of course, this attracted rats. And even just the presence of human beings there, warm, damp places, attracted rats. And rats were present in the trenches all the time. There were undoubtedly more rats than there were humans, even. And at the height of the war, there were 3 million humans living in the trenches of the Western Front. Um, and so these French soldiers have taken to displaying the rats that they have captured, and you can see that they're monsters. If you compare some of the bodies of these rats to, say, the forearms of the French soldiers who are holding them up, you realize that some of these rats, not including the tail, have grown to a size where the rat is essentially the size of a man's forearm, so essentially a foot long. And these rats were present everywhere, and they might even you might even wake up at night to find a rat nibbling on your foot, on the flesh of the foot, because trench foot had killed the soft tissue, including the nerves in the foot. And so you might not even realize that a rat was sitting there gnawing on the sort of dead flesh of the foot. But you would spot him doing it and kick him off. Um, Also, there were tapeworms, which infested the food, would get up into the food, and soldiers would ingest them. And a tapeworm then would take up residence in the intestine and would effectively start digesting all of the calories that the man had ingested, and then would begin to grow. Soldiers would experience a state of being listless, without energy, because all of the calories they were hoping to consume for themselves were instead being consumed by this tapeworm living in their intestine. Um, and these tapeworms grew to enormous sizes as well. There was an American soldier who was admitted to a field hospital. They concluded that something was in his uh, intestinal tract. They pumped his stomach, and they pulled a tapeworm that had grown to 3 feet in length out of this man's intestine. Um, soldiers soldiers typically had to sleep in an upright position, as you see these German soldiers doing in the sort of bottom picture there, because there wasn't a lot of space in the trenches. I mentioned earlier that at the height of the war, there were 3 million men living in the trenches of the Western Front. And if you want to do a little bit of math on that, you could say, well, okay, 3 million men living in the trenches, let's divide it roughly equally between the Germans and the Allies. So that's 1.5 million men. Then think about the fact that the trenches extended for 600 miles. So you take your 1.5 million men and you spread them out over 600 miles. Um, this is going to come to let's see. I'm actually calculating this as we do this. One 1.5 million men divided over 600 miles. That's 2,500 men per mile, um, in miles around 5,000 feet. So what we're saying is that the average soldier had really 2 feet, 2 linear feet of space in the trench. Now, it wasn't as bad as that. Um, it wasn't nearly as bad as that because soldiers rotated out of the trenches. They rotated into reserve duty. They rotated into going on leave. So probably a more reasonable number was 6 to 8 linear feet. Nevertheless, each soldier had only 6 to 8 linear feet of trench space that was sort of his own. And so there wasn't a lot of space to sleep. They slept in these upright positions, and also with water in the bottom of the trench. If you have 10 inches of water in the trench, you can't really lay down either. And so sleep, the position in which men slept, didn't allow them to sleep very, very well. But also, you've got the bursting of shells. Um, Also, during the war, both sides developed phosphorus flares, which they would launch into the air, and these flares would burst. And if you've ever been to a fireworks display and you've seen a firework that simply burst with bright white light, that's typically phosphorus. And they developed these flares which would burst with this bright white light, and then it would burn for several seconds as it slowly drifted down. Sometimes it had a little parachute attached, and this was meant to sort of keep soldiers on the other side awake. They would order artillery bombardments during the night to wake up the soldiers on the other side. So they were really engaged in a form of psychological warfare against each other, trying to deprive each other of adequate sleep, forcing the enemy awake. And so physical and mental exhaustion was a common problem of soldiers living in the trenches. Um, Early in the war, there had been a rotation system that basically promised to move soldiers quickly from frontline trenches to the reserve trenches, and then to sort of duty behind the trenches, and then finally to leave, to going on leave. So the way that the trench networks were set up, there were usually two frontline trenches, a primary trench and a secondary trench. First line, second line, whatever you want to call it. The primary trench was the one right up against no man's land, which was the space that separated the two trench networks from each other. That first line trench and the second line trench, the second line was really just a backup for the first, so that if the enemy did get across no man's land, drove you out of the first trench, you could retreat to the second and sort of continue the fight. Farther back was then what was called a reserve trench, where there was a group of reserve soldiers held, and they could move quickly up and down the line, so that if there was a breakthrough in a sector of the trenches and the men were forced from the first to the second trench, the reserve soldiers could move to that area and then move up to join the soldiers who were fighting in the second trench to try to sort of stop the sort of breach of the lines that the enemy had achieved. So those were considered two separate duties. Being in the frontline trenches, that was one duty. Being in the reserve trench was a second duty. Being behind the trenches doing non-combat work like moving supplies or digging new trenches, that was a third sort of assignment. And so you would rotate. So you might spend at the beginning of the war 2 weeks in the front lines trench, 2 weeks in the reserve trench, 2 weeks behind the trenches, and then you might go for a week of leave before. And so if you were on leave, if you were a German soldier or a French soldier, you might actually go home. They might even give you 2 weeks of leave. British soldiers were more likely to have to go find a nice French family in the countryside who would give them a bed and a hot bath and good homemade food. But the idea was that leave then would give you a chance to truly be, in fact, even just being in the supply duty or the duty behind the trenches would give you a little bit of a break from the physical and mental toll of being up in the trenches. And then leave would really get you refreshed. And then they'd rotate you back into the frontline trenches. But as the war progressed, and more soldiers were needed, and more of them were dying, that system broke down, and soldiers were finding themselves spending an increasing amount of time in the exhausting condition of being in those frontline trenches. And of course, as the body became more physically exhausted, it became more vulnerable to disease, to the spread of disease. And of course, when soldiers were all packed together the way they were in the trenches, again, each soldier only having maybe 6 or 8 linear feet of space, disease spread very rapidly in the trenches. So, for example, the influenza epidemic of 1918, part of the reason why it became such a widespread phenomenon was that it was spread by soldiers living in the trenches. Now, that's sort of just the story of what it was like to live in the trenches. We haven't even talked about the fighting yet. And of course, fighting in the trenches was an exercise in futility. Um, you probably know that tactics in World War I were essentially unchanged from the tactics employed by Napoleon Bonaparte when he was fighting his wars 100 plus years prior to the First World War. Armies massed men for direct frontal assaults against the enemy trenches. This was called going over the top. You would mass large numbers of soldiers in the sector of the trenches where you believed you had the best chance at breaching the enemy trench. And all at once, the men would climb up out of their trenches and, in a wave, cross over no man's land in a desperate attempt to reach the enemy trenches, drive the enemy out of those trenches, and capture the enemy trenches and force the enemy to retreat. Um, but this usually didn't go very well. No man's land ranged from 50 yards wide in some sectors of the Western Front, so the armies were practically on top of each other, to, in some cases, 3 and 4 miles wide in other sectors. But regardless of the amount of space, the amount of territory that you had to cross over, if you were going over the top, the amount of no man's land that you had to traverse to get to the enemy trenches, you were going up against a type of technology that Napoleon Bonaparte never had to deal with. You have to remember that you know the reason why Napoleon Bonaparte could mass his men for these direct frontal assaults, which were basically bayonet charges. Um, Napoleon's soldiers fixed bayonets, and that was the primary weapon that they were going to use when they reached their enemy. But they were fighting against an enemy whose guns fired at a very low rate of fire. It took so long to reload that an expert soldier could probably only get maybe 3 shots off per minute. And that was the only, and their range was not great. So by the time Bonaparte's soldiers came within the range of the guns that were being fired by whomever he was attacking, they probably only had about 1 minute before the French soldiers were on them and bayoneting them. And in that time, you probably only get off 3 shots, the first of which probably hit nothing. and only the second two of which even had a chance of hitting their target because the guns weren't very accurate either. So it made sense for Napoleon to launch frontal assaults with fixed bayonets. And yet, and artillery was not as advanced yet either. Um, but those tactics, the tactics of launching frontal assaults with fixed bayonets, with the intention of bayoneting your enemy when you got up to him, that tactic was still being employed by officers on both sides during the First World War, as you see with these British soldiers climbing out of their trench to go over the top. They've got their bayonets fixed. Well, the reality is that there were almost no bayonet wounds. I shouldn't say almost none, but a tiny fraction of the battlefield wounds suffered during the First World War were caused by bayonets. Um, the the weaponry now had changed so much in the last 100 years, and this gave a huge advantage to whoever was playing defense. Um, the rifles that they used were a much more rapid fire rifle. A trained soldier could get off uh, 10 to 15 shots in a minute, and their range, they were accurate over so much greater range. Um, you know, 1,000 feet, you could easily hit your target with an aimed rifle shot. And of course, there were machine guns as well. By this time, a machine gun had a rate of fire of about 600 rounds per minute, which is 10 rounds, 10 bullets per second. So it's that like that. That's how fast the machine guns were firing. So you get the idea. Times had changed, but the tactics hadn't. Technology had changed, but the tactics hadn't. So, to drive the enemy from his trench, troops were going over the top across no man's land. And basically, from the time that they appeared out of their trenches, unless they were in a sector of the battlefield where a sector of the front where no man's land was truly 3 or 4 miles wide, basically from the time you got up out of your trench, you were going to be under fire. First artillery fire, then rifle fire, then machine gun fire. Now, um, before going over the top, there would often be a massive artillery barrage. So your side, the side of the soldiers who were going to go over the top and attack the enemy trench, would be supported by a massive artillery bombardment that was supposed to soften up the enemy's defenses. Um, the By World War One, you were now no longer dealing with the kinds of cannon fire that Napoleon was dealing with either. In Napoleon's time, the cannons were firing what were called solid shot, which was really just a solid iron ball, which could certainly do damage, to whatever target it struck, be it a physical barrier or a human being. But by World War One, the artillery, the cannon were firing high explosive shells. And we'll get into those more in just a minute. But those high explosive shells could be fused so that they would not explode until they struck the ground. And so you could fuse those kinds of shells so that they would explode when they hit the ground, and that was used to try to break apart enemy defenses. And the problem, though, is that as the war progressed, more and more of the trenches were equipped with these underground bunkers called dugouts. So you would actually dig below the level of the trench. In the wall of the trench, you would dig down deeper into the actual bedrock. And you could create a sort of a hollowed out underground shelter. And you would reinforce the roof of that shelter with timbers, as you see here, wooden timbers, to help reinforce the shelter. And then on the top of that, you would pile sandbags. And this would create a sort of a protective shelter where soldiers could go during the time when an artillery bombardment was going on. So if your trenches were being bombarded by enemy artillery, Soldiers in your trench could go down into these underground shelters, sometimes called bomb-proof shelters or dugout shelters, and you could essentially ride out the artillery bombardment. And when the bombardment stopped, that meant that that the enemy troops were now crossing no man's land. The bombardment would stop because they didn't want to hit their own men as they crossed no man's land. You could come up out of these shelters and you could prepare to defend yourself. So generally speaking, as the war moved forward, the artillery bombardments that were meant to sort of soften up the enemy in advance of an attack, in advance of going over the top, really didn't do any good. As a matter of fact, if anything, they simply signaled to the enemy what sector of the lines was about to be attacked, and they could send their reserves to that sector. So these artillery bombardments that were meant to support the attacking troops generally didn't help at all, and if anything, it actually caused bigger problems for them. Now, I mentioned these high explosive shells that were now being fired by artillery during the war. So it's also worth mentioning that it wasn't just the shells that the artillery were firing that had undergone improvement. The artillery themselves had undergone improvement. They had greater range, greater accuracy, and a greater rate of fire, just like the rifles did. But the shells, which were filled with explosive material, I mentioned they could be fused to explode on contact with the ground to blast apart enemy defenses. But another option was to fuse these shells so that they would explode maybe 20 feet above the ground. And these were called shrapnel shells. So you had two kinds of shells. You had percussion shells, which were high explosive shells meant to explode when they strike the ground and blast apart defenses. And you also had shrapnel, high explosive shrapnel shells, which were filled with shrapnel, which was bits of metal, basically. And those would be fused to explode about 20 feet above the ground. And when those exploded, they would blast these little bits of shrapnel, these little bits of metal, uh, down toward the men below at explosive speeds. And these bits of shrapnel then would tear into men's bodies. And as a matter of fact, in World War One, a lot of times we think about the men defending the trenches with their rifles and their machine guns, and we sort of imagine that the soldiers going over the top were suffering wounds from those rifles and those machine guns. But in fact, 85% of all battlefield wounds suffered during the First World War were caused by high explosive shrapnel shells blasting um, blasting these bits of shrapnel down on the soldiers who were attempting to cross no man's land. Now, for soldiers who were hunkered down in the trenches playing defense, they weren't as subject to those kinds of wounds. At the beginning of the war, yes, because you'd launched an artillery bombardment prior to going over the top, and the soldiers in the trenches would be suffering from shrapnel being blasted down at them. But once they began digging those bomb-proof shelters, those underground dugout shelters, that protected the soldiers who were defending the trenches from the shrapnel that was being blasted at them from these explosive shells. And it was really just the soldiers who were crossing no man's land who were suffering from those. And they were all exposed. Soldiers who were crossing no man's land were really fully exposed to the worst of that shrapnel. And this was the reason why armies gave up their old cloth hats and had to adopt the steel helmets that were more typical of World War One and future wars. And notice that almost all of the steel helmets also had a sort of a wide brim to protect the eyes and to protect the neck. So the steel helmet itself protecting the skull and the head, and then the brim to protect the eyes and the neck from shrapnel being blasted down at explosive speeds from above. The other thing about the artillery was that artillerists learned how to what was called walk their fire forward to keep pace with advancing troops. And so, if you were uh, a group of soldiers who were advancing across no man's land, you might see, a sort of a wall of artillery fire that was being fired at you from the enemy, and you're looking at it ahead of you, and you're saying, "Okay, if I can just get through that, and I'll come out on the other side, and I'll be fine." But that wasn't true, because once you entered that wall of artillery fire, you would discover that it would follow you as you continued across no man's land. The enemy artillerists would walk their artillery fire forward with you as you were crossing no man's land. Now, on the other hand, the soldiers who were attacking, also their artillerists who were firing artillery to support them, they could walk their artillery fire forward ahead of the soldiers who were trying to work their way across no man's land as a way of forcing enemy troops to stay down. The idea was that your artillery would help keep the enemy pinned down and not shooting their rifles and not shooting their machine guns at you. So just as the uh, enemy artillerists were trying to keep their curtain of artillery fire over your head as you advanced across no man's land, your own artillerists might be advancing their own curtain of artillery fire ahead of you to try to keep the enemy pinned down and not shooting their rifles and machine guns at you. But it was very difficult. It was very difficult to it was difficult for the soldiers who were advancing across no man's land to keep pace with this curtain of artillery fire that was preceding them. And oftentimes, a large gap would grow between the curtain of artillery fire that was meant to provide them support and them themselves as they were crossing no man's land. And so, what would happen is the curtain of artillery fire that was supposed to support them would hit the enemy troops, who would be, however, down in their bomb-proof shelters, riding it out, and then there would be a gap between that fire, and of course, at some point they would have to give up anyway because they're in danger of hitting their own men. There would be a gap, and in that gap, the soldiers defending the trenches would come up out of their shelters, set up their machine guns, get themselves into position to start firing their rifles. So, unfortunately, generally speaking, it didn't do any good. It didn't do any good for the soldiers advancing across no man's land, for the attacking soldiers. Didn't do them any good to have artillery assisting them. Um, and on the other hand, the enemy artillery was staying with them as they advanced across no man's land, and it was not until the last maybe 500 feet that they came out from under that. So once for that portion of soldiers who did make it across no man's land and actually reached close proximity to the enemy trench, the enemy trench was almost always protected by barbed wire fences or coiled barbed wire simply laid on the ground, and even minefields. Um, Barbed wire was not meant to do any harm to soldiers directly. I mean, don't get me wrong. So, if you're not familiar with barbed wire, it's a sort of a wire or cord that has little metal barbs or hooks in it. And yes, if these little barbs or hooks caught on your skin, it could tear open your skin and give you quite a nasty cut, laceration. But that wasn't the main purpose of it. The main purpose of it was to catch in your clothing, catch in your uniform, because this would slow you down. And generally speaking, the more a man struggled to loose his clothing from the barbed wire, the more barbs got caught in other parts of the clothing, and it became very difficult to extricate yourself from the barbed wire, whether it was a fence like what you see these men crossing through here in the upper left hand, or whether it was coiled barbed wire, as you see this poor British soldier hanging on after being shot down. It was very difficult, and even if a group of soldiers was successful in getting across no man's land, oftentimes they would now pile up on the barbed wire. And that would make them especially vulnerable to enemy rifle fire and machine gun fire. So I mentioned that the machine gun fire, machine guns in World War I had a rate of 600 rounds per minute, and its fire could reach a range of 1,000 feet. And this was sort of like the base defense of the trenches, because the machine gunners would simply, they had their machine guns mounted on a swivel, and they would simply swivel their machine gun back and forth, creating a sort of cloud of bullets. And then, of course, then you also had riflemen who were keeping up a sort of a steady, aimed fire, picking off soldiers who somehow managed to escape the cloud of bullets being fired by the machine guns. So it was very rare for soldiers to even get to that point, to even get past the barbed wire, because of the amount of artillery fire that they would have had to come through just to get across no man's land. It was very well rare just to get to the barbed wire. It was extremely rare to get beyond the barbed wire. So if you are that small, elite, perhaps extremely lucky, if you want to call it that, group of soldiers who managed to get beyond the barbed wire and were now ready to directly assault the enemy soldiers in their trench, it was pretty rare for the numbers of soldiers who actually made it to that point to be sufficient to actually drive the enemy out of their frontline trenches. Because even if you achieved a minor breach and were able to somehow signal that you had achieved a minor breach in the enemy trench, pouring in reserves from your end to support your attack was much harder than the enemy defending the trench simply bringing up their reserves from the reserve trench only a few hundred feet behind. It was much more difficult. And so the reality is that, and even if you managed to achieve a major breach, the enemy could bring in reserves from other sectors of the front by railroad. So it was really, really hard. Um, Even if you manage to get past the barbed wire to then actually drive the enemy from the trenches and force them back. Generally speaking, soldiers who did get to that point usually became prisoners. And about 10% of the soldiers who fought in World War II experienced being taken prisoner. Many were killed at the point of capture. The rest were sent to POW camps. And prisoners of war in World War I were not, for the most part, deliberately exterminated as they were in Hitler's World War II prison camps. But of course, nations at war struggled to provide their own army and their own civilian population with adequate food, adequate medical care. And so, of course, it was not a priority to provide prisoners who were taken in battle with adequate food or adequate medical care. And so, millions of World War I soldiers died as prisoners of war, died of hunger, died of disease, died of neglect of wounds, and then sort of infections. And what's crazy about all of this is that despite the futility of the tactics that were employed by the World War I armies, um, the war was really marked by a lack of innovation. And I guess I would say, despite the fact that the war lasted for 4 years, so there was plenty of time to realize that the Napoleonic tactics that they were using didn't work. There's plenty of time to realize that, and plenty of time to try to become innovative and develop something new. Um, there really wasn't a lot of innovation. The officers either lacked the creativity or perhaps the authority to devise better tactics. And generally speaking, when assaults failed, the way that World War I officers adjusted uh, to to try to do better the next time was to just increase the number of men who were being sent on the assault. So a second wave, a third wave. That was the average. That was really almost all World War I officers' answer to the failure of attacks was we didn't send enough men. So we'll send a second wave, a third wave. And that didn't lead to success. It only led to greater and greater numbers of casualties, greater numbers of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. And so there were some officers who, by a year into the war, because they lacked, again, either the creativity or the authority to try different tactics, they hoped that new technologies that were going to be introduced during the war might provide a breakthrough that would allow the sides who were attacking to actually have a chance at getting across no man's land and taking the enemy trench. There was a hope that new technologies could break the stalemate on the Western Front. And so, when we move to the second part of this lesson, which will be video lesson number 7, we'll examine whether that panned out that way. There were new technologies introduced on the battlefield in World War I: poison gas, tanks, aircraft, in addition to, for example, the better machine guns and better artillery. And the question was, could those technologies make a difference in how the war was fought and actually make it possible for soldiers crossing no man's land to be successful and capture enemy trenches? So we'll get to that in our next lesson. And until then, I hope that you are doing well. Stay healthy, stay safe. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye bye.